In 1928, in the Finnish capital of Helsinki, a linguist stood up to read a short paper. Its title was Remarks on the Korean Language. Everything in it came down to a single sentence. I have found the relatives of Korean. Until that day, Korean had no known relatives anywhere on Earth. Not knowing a language's roots means not knowing where its speakers came from. And the man who set out to fill that blank was a Finn, 7,000 kilometers from the Korean peninsula. Yet a century later, Korean still stands alone in the field's standard classification. And that is after countless scholars have thrown themselves at the problem. So was his announcement simply wrong. This is the 100-year hunt for the family of the Korean language. Fair warning, a suspect is named twice and cleared twice. The story begins not in Korea, but in Finland. Languages have family trees of their own. English, French, and Russian all split long ago from one ancestral tongue, so they belong to a single household. Yet in the middle of 19th century Europe, Finnish alone had no name on that tree. So Finnish scholars looked east. Our relatives must lie out beyond the steppe, they thought. That idea grew into Altaic, a vast hypothesis roping together Finnish and Hungarian, Turkic, Mongolic, and Manchu. Gustav John Ramstedt, born in 1873, was the Finn who went to test that hypothesis on horseback. From 1898, he spent well over a decade wandering the Mongolian steppe. He wrote down the speech of the people he met, tent by tent. He was not a scholar raised at a desk. Inside the tents, he listened to nomads speak and built their grammar on the spot. That is why Europe came to call him the father of Altaic linguistics. Then, in 1920, his life changed direction. Newly independent Finland named him its first envoy to Japan. Overnight, a linguist became a diplomat, seated in Tokyo. In Tokyo, he ran into a language he had never heard before. It was spoken by students who had come over from Korea. And to his astonishment, its skeleton looked like the Mongolian he had been transcribing on the steppe. In 1924, he met Goguryeo, a young man from Andong in Korea's southeast, who was then studying in Tokyo, a diplomat at the legation and a student from a colonized country. For 2 years, the two of them dug into Korean together. Those 2 years became the paper of 1928. Korean, it argued, had branched off the Altaic line very early. That was the moment the first suspect was named in a 100-year case. Ramstedt's first move was to split that giant hypothesis in two. Finnish and Hungarian he assigned to the Uralic family. Everything left over formed the Altaic family. From Turkey to Siberia, it held Turkic, Mongolic, and Tungusic, the branch that includes Manchu. And Korean, he declared, was the fourth brother of that Altaic family. The evidence looked plain to the eye. Every one of these languages puts the verb at the end of the sentence. Every one builds meaning by gluing particles onto the back of words, and not one of them has relative pronouns. It was far too much overlap to be coincidence. Scholars in Korea took this picture as settled for a long time. For nearly a century, the question of where Korean came from had an answer ready, and that answer was Altaic. There was relief in believing the roots had been found. But there was one problem buried in all of this. The very evidence just listed cannot prove that two languages are relatives. By the time that testing began in earnest, Ramstedt was already gone. He died in Helsinki in 1950, and the survey of Altaic linguistics he had worked on all his life was left unfinished. its first volume appearing 2 years later. Before those posthumous volumes were even complete, the demolition of the house he had built began. A test for deciding whether two languages are relatives already existed. It is not whether the grammar looks alike. It is whether the sounds of words diverge by rule. Resemblance can happen by chance, but a pattern in the way things fail to match cannot. Take the English words foot and father. Both of them begin with an F sound. The Latin words for the same things are pes and pater. That same slot comes out as a P every time. When dozens of words diverge in exactly the same way, and not just one, only then do we call two languages relatives. Held against the Altaic hypothesis, that ruler exposed a problem. Overlapping words between Turkic, Mongolic, and Korean certainly existed. But the words that overlapped were things like horse, saddle, and metal. Consider hand, eye, blood, mother, one, two. These basic words, the ones a child learns first and speakers almost never borrow, did not line up at all. What lined up instead were exactly the words that travel between neighbors who trade with each other and fight each other. The German scholar Gerhard Dorfer pushed on exactly this point. The Altaic languages resemble one another, he argued, not because they share an ancestor, but because they spent thousands of years as neighbors on the same steppe. The resemblance was not blood. It was contact. The first suspect had an alibi. The vast family Ramstead had drawn across Eurasia was quietly erased after he closed his eyes. 100 years of investigation went back to square one. So what about the nearest neighbor? On grammar alone, Japanese and Korean are all but twins. They share the same word order, particles in the same slots, even parallel systems of honorific speech. And here's something strange happens. Count from 1 to 3 and nothing matches at all. Korean hana, do. Set stands against Japanese itotsu, futatsu, mitsu. There is no rule to be found in any slot. In grammar, they are twins. In basic vocabulary, complete strangers. So for 100 years, every attempt to bind Korean and Japanese to one root came within reach of proof and slipped. But there was one small hole in that wall. The geography treatise of the Samguk Sagi, compiled in 1145, records in Chinese characters the old names of the land Silla took from Goguryeo. When every place name was converted to Chinese style in 757, the names as they had stood before were set down alongside. And each town's old name comes in two versions. One writes the meaning in Chinese characters, and the other writes, in Chinese characters, the sound the local people actually said. So if the meaning side carries the character for 3, while the sound side reads mill, then in the tongue of that land, 3 was mill. 4 numbers were pulled out this way. 3 was mil, 5 was ucha, 7 was nanun, 10 was dok. Meanwhile, in Old Japanese, 3 is mi, 7 is nana, and 10 is towo. The numbers that refused to match in Korean lined up in the place names of Goguryeo. The Korean linguist Lee Ki-moon drew a picture out of this and called it the Buyo languages. There was a northern tongue behind the founding of Goguryeo and Baekje, and one of its branches crossed the sea and became Japanese. On that account, Korean and Japanese are not siblings, but something closer to cousins. But the limits of this clue were just as clear. All that survives is roughly 100 words salvaged from those place names. And because scholars disagree over what sound a Chinese character carried more than 1,000 years ago, Christopher Beckwith's reading of the names as broadly Japanese drew criticism that his grounds were arbitrary. One more person has to be named here. He was Alexander Vovin, a linguist born in Russia. He started out on the side of the Altaic hypothesis and set out to prove that Korean and Japanese came from one root. And he came back with the opposite conclusion. He went through all 347 word pairs an earlier scholar had gathered as evidence of common origin, and more than 260 of them failed the standard. 8 out of every 10 fell away. Many of the survivors turned out to be words one side had borrowed from the other. The man who set out to prove his own hypothesis had pulled it down with his own hands. Now, the second suspect had an alibi too. That did not close the case. In 2021, a team led by Martin Rabitz published a paper in Nature. They revived the claim that the languages once under suspicion, from Korean and Japanese to Turkic, all belonged to a single household after all. This time they cross-checked language against archaeology and genetics, and placed the root among millet farmers on the West Liao River in northeast China 9,000 years ago. That is more than 4,000 years before the pyramids went up in Egypt. A rebuttal came the very next year. Of the word pairs that paper put forward, only 17 actually passed the standard its own authors had set. Vovin, moments ago in this story, had put more than 300 pairs on the table. 100 years on, the argument had reopened on exactly the same ground. So here is where the field's standard classification stands today. The family is called Koreanic. Its members number 2, Korean and Jeju. The vast family that once stretched across Eurasia is gone from the map. This is not a verdict that Korean has no relatives. It is a marker that says, not proven yet. Speech sounds shift a little with every generation, and once those shifts pile up for thousands of years, they erase the traces that two languages were ever one. A relative old enough simply wears the evidence away. So were the years Ramstead poured into this wasted? In 1938, in colonial Korea, Korean language lessons were pushed out of the required school curriculum. And the very next year, 7,000 kilometers away in Helsinki, a Korean grammar written in English came off the press. And through the pages of that book runs the voice of one student. It was Ryujin Jo, the young man from Andong who had sat across from Ramstead for 2 years in Tokyo. A language being pushed out of its own land was kept as a record in the hands of one foreigner and one student. The search for the family is still unsolved, 100 years in. But everywhere that search passed, the grammar and the etymology of Korean were written down. The century that failed to find the roots was also the century that looked at Korean most closely. The lineage and the basic facts of Korean and of the world's other languages are laid out in English in the LANGRA archive. The link in the description takes you straight there. If the hunt for Korean's family drew you in, subscribe and join the next investigation.